Scripture reading for this morning is Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 21. And that may be found on page 980 in the Pew Bibles. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage now, as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. God's holy word.
Somewhat rare, really, for a New Year's Day to fall on a Sunday like it does this year. Might not seem all that rare. If you remember, we last opened the year with a Sunday back in 2017, which is just 5 years ago. But really, the next time it's going to happen is going to be 11 years from today. That'll be January 1st, 2034. There's just something about starting a new year that causes people to become rather contemplative about life. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's seeing the blank pages of a brand new calendar that hasn't been marked on yet, that gives the person hope that things might be different in the new year, that they'll be better somehow going forward. Maybe that's what it is. But for that reason, because people see a new year as a new beginning, the start of a new year typically causes many people to make resolutions, to change something about themselves or something about their lives. They resolve and determine to do different things. We aren't immune from that tendency in the church either. So since New Year's Day falls on a Sunday this year, I thought we might take some time to consider how we might improve our lives as Christ followers in 2023. What might we do differently starting a new year? The things I'm going to show you this morning are intensely personal. Much like when we see Joshua challenge the people of Israel when he said, "Choose this day whom you will serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." This is a personal decision, and the things I'm going to show you today apply to people everywhere. Really, they apply whether or not the person is a follower of Jesus Christ. But they have special significance for those who do follow Christ. And I think I can claim without fear of contradiction that each one of us here this morning would say that we would like to make progress in our Christian walk, in our walk with Christ, that we want to be better Christians when we reach the end of 2023 than we are today. I'd hope that would be the case anyway. I hope nobody would say, no, I'm content where I'm at. But we all want to improve, but most times we approach change in our Christian walk the way Alice did in Lewis Carroll's famous book, Alice in Wonderland, who, while seeking directions from the Cheshire Cat, asked him, said, "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" "That depends a good deal on where you want to get to," said the cat. "I don't much care where," said Alice. "Then it doesn't matter which way you go," said the cat. So long as I get somewhere, Alice added as an explanation. Oh, you're sure to do that, said the cat, if you only walk long enough. If you don't have a direction in mind, if you don't have a destination, how will you know when you get there? We're sure to get somewhere. But as we discover, not all change is positive change. Not all movement is progress. So we want to know that we are heading for the right thing, that we're doing the right things. And if we're going to experience positive change and make progress in our spiritual walk, we have to take sure that what we're aiming for is the right thing and that we're going about it the right way. Because it's very frustrating to work hard to climb a ladder only to later discover that the ladder is leaning against the wrong wall. And we're getting somewhere with our climbing that we never wanted to be in the first place. And the reason many Christ followers struggle in their walk can be traced back not just to what they're doing, but why they're doing it, what it is that motivates them. Because even doing the right things for the wrong reasons is detrimental to our spiritual health. And while there is any number of factors that can go into forming someone's motivation, we can look at motivation under two really broad categories, as Paul does: living for self and living for Christ. The first motivation is the one that most people follow, even most believers follow. That's living for self. Paul mentions this motivation just one chapter over in Philippians 2:21, where he writes concerning the believers in the city where he was imprisoned. He says, "For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ." Understand that the Apostle Paul was talking about people who weren't bad people. They weren't bad. They were good people. They were fellow believers. They were members of the church where he was imprisoned. I imagine they were very active in their church. I imagine they were attending church and Bible studies, listening to sermons, serving in various ministries, giving back to God from the resources that God had blessed them with. I imagine they were doing all of those things. They weren't bad people. But their motivation was wrong. They were self-serving. They were seeking their own interests. And that's a common malady, even in churches today. We're prone to do that. Let's admit it. We all have a selfish streak. Anybody here want to claim that you don't have a selfish streak? We all do. We're naturally interested in ourselves, in our advancements, in our needs, and our wants and our concerns. Those things interest us a great deal. After all, the second greatest commandment, according to Jesus, that comes after love your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The second one that comes after that is to love your neighbor as yourself. Our capacity for self-love is limitless. We love ourselves. We would do anything for ourselves. But when we live for self, we're living according to the wrong motivation. So let me be clear. What I'm talking about isn't what you do or what you don't do. That's not what I'm talking about here at all. I'm not trying to guilt anyone here this morning into doing more. Can we be clear on that? I'm not trying to guilt you into doing more. Attending more, giving more, or even spending more personal time with the Lord. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is why you do or don't do all of those things. And all the other things that you do or don't do. Why are you doing them? Why are you not doing them? What motivates you? What is your motivation behind the decision to serve or not to serve in a particular ministry? If you're asked to serve, what's your motivation for not doing that? Or for doing it? What's your motivation to attend church? What's your motivation to attend a Bible study or to participate in worship or to use the gifts that God has given you? Whatever the case may be, what motivates you to do that? Well, just a little earlier in Philippians 2:3, Paul had just commanded his readers, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. Again, Paul's writing about motivation, and he says, don't let your own satisfaction be what motivates you. Don't allow your personal desires and what others think of you to be the primary thing that drives you. Then in verse 4, he wrote, let each of you look not only to his own interest. Notice he doesn't say here, don't consider your own interests at all. You can consider your own interests. He says that self-interest shouldn't be the only factor one considers. Don't just look to your own interests. And in the context, he's talking about also taking the interests of others into account here. But at the end of verse 21, he indicates that all other believers there were so wrapped up in their own interests that they were ignoring even the interests of Jesus Christ. They were ignoring everyone else's, but also Jesus's. Remember, these weren't bad people. They were people who were prone to the same self-interest that we war against regularly. Going to Philippi, which was what Paul was talking about here, was no small thing. Travel was much more difficult and lengthy in those days. And the people had families. They likely had businesses and other interests the same as we do today. They weren't contemplating here a short-term, week-long missions trip to Philippi. Going there would have meant a major commitment, a major sacrifice. I saw that it would have taken maybe 2 months simply to travel to Philippi, and then 2 months back. And then whatever time you spent there, this was a big deal. They allowed themselves to be motivated more by their own interests than they should have, just as we often do. That brings us to our second motivation, the one that we should have, living for Christ. That was Paul's motivation. Look with me again at Philippians 1:21. He says, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. We tend to focus on the last half of that verse more than we do the first half as we contemplate the joys of eternity with Christ and the gain that we will have then. That's a great thing. We'll consider that in just a little bit here. But Paul is also revealing here what should be the motivation for living here, today. The reality for all people should be to do this, but especially true for followers of Christ, that for me to live is Christ. So let's explore what Paul means here when he says to live is Christ. What does that mean in Paul's mind? Well, basically what Paul's indicating is that everything about his life points to Christ with the intention of bringing him glory. This is more than saying that Christ was at the center of his life. It's saying that Christ and the things of Christ are one's life. That's what you're living for. It's what living for you is all about. We see that what Paul means here illustrated by his circumstances when he wrote those words. Paul was in a Roman prison. He was in prison awaiting sentencing, and he had been in prison for somewhere close to 2 years when he wrote this letter. He said that others were emboldened to preach Christ while he was in prison. They were out sharing the gospel, and that while some were doing so from goodwill and from love for him, others were trying their best to hurt him because they saw themselves as being in competition with Paul. So here he is, restricted in his movements, restricted in what he can do, and yet others are out preaching the gospel. I would think being chained between 2 Roman guards 24 hours a day and not even be able to go to the bathroom by yourself might be enough to turn most of us sour. But that wasn't Paul. Paul said that everything he was going through had served to advance the gospel. He said his imprisonment had given him the opportunity to preach to the imperial guard. Not only preach to them, but to live out Christ before them. They were chained to him as much as he was chained to them. He had their full attention. Whether he was in prison or free, Paul's motivation was that Christ would be preached. And he was preaching Christ while he was in prison, as others were outside of prison. To live as Christ certainly means sharing the message of the gospel, and Paul was all about that. As the book of Acts and his letters show, Paul would and did preach the gospel anytime, anywhere, and to anybody. He was a dynamo. But to live as Christ means more than sharing the gospel, because it permeates and encompasses all of life. And Paul's goal in life was to have those who saw him see Christ. He wrote to the Corinthian church, "Be imitators of me as I am of Christ." For a time, the WWJD, what would Jesus do, bracelets were all the rage. And that truly is the lifestyle that to live as Christ indicates. To live as Christ means striving to have one's every word and action align with what Jesus would say and do in the same circumstance. To be a virtual clone of Christ, if we were to put it that way. Notice that Paul didn't even care whether he lived or died, as long as Christ was honored by it. Paul's entire motivation in life was Christ alone, to bring him glory and to show people Jesus by his life and his eventual death. I'm pretty sure that Paul would have rather not been in prison. If he'd had his druthers, I'm sure he wouldn't have been in prison. But he wasn't motivated by what he wanted. He was motivated by what he could do where he was to show Christ to those around him. He didn't care that people were trying to hurt him, because his delight was that Christ was being preached in spite of their motives. Paul was able to be joyful even in a terrible situation because he had the right motivation for living. Why we do what we do is important. But we also need to consider why we're here and what is the proper purpose for life. Notice how Paul begins this verse with the words, "for me." Paul here is making an emphatic personal statement. He feels very strongly about the point that he's making in stating what his life is about. He's saying, in effect, I can't speak for you, but this is what my life is all about. This is what makes life worth living for me. How do you think most people would complete Paul's statement? For me to live is blank. How do you think most people would complete that today? Looking around at our society, I think we could easily list some perennial favorites. Possessions. For me to live is possessions, power, popularity, pleasure. Those would all fit. Then there's a new one that's becoming quite dominant of late. Privilege. For me to live is privilege. Competing for privilege has become so popular that a whole new way of determining who prevails through what's known as intersectionality had to be created, where everybody competes and whoever checks the most boxes gets to sit on top of the privilege pyramid, at least until some new measurement is created or some new category is devised that knocks them off. Really, all of those things just come down to mankind's ages-old search for significance. We all want to be significant in this world, whatever that means to us. Many others might fill in the blank with good things, like my family. For me to live is my family, or my kids, or my spouse. I mean, at least those make you appear less self-centered. They're good things. Maybe a person's feeling super spiritual. They might complete the blank and fill that in with my ministry. For me to live is my ministry. Can I clue you into something? None of those things are permanent. Not anything that I've listed here is permanent. They're all going to end. None of them is worth living for. None of it is worthy of being elevated to the essence of life status. Notice again what Paul says in Philippians 1:21, because it's crucial that we get this right. He says, for me to live is Christ. Paul's purpose for living is the person of Jesus Christ. It's not to labor for Christ. It's not to talk about Christ. It's not to sacrifice for Christ. It's not about doing anything for Christ. Paul's open secret to joyful living is that his purpose is a person. He lives for the person of Christ. Now, don't misunderstand me here. One's purpose is going to be lived out in their life, and having Christ as one's purpose will have tangible results in ministry and so forth. It will result in you doing things. But we dare not allow those ancillary results to become the purpose for which we live. Let me illustrate what I mean here. Paul was a missionary church planter, right? We all agree. Paul traveled all over and he planted churches. He was so passionate about taking the gospel into new territory that he wrote in Romans 15:20 that he made it his ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ had already been named, lest he build on someone else's foundation. Paul was passionate about taking the gospel into new areas and planting churches. Well, what happens to an itinerant church planter when they're arrested, placed in chains in prison, if their purpose is to travel and establish new churches? Paul was passionate about spreading the gospel. There's no doubt about that. But the purpose of his life was Christ. And that's why he spread the gospel as he did. So when Paul found himself chained between two Roman guards in prison, he continued to live out his purpose in front of the guards, so that it became known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest what Paul was about. And because his purpose was Christ, he could rejoice when others were emboldened to preach the word without fear while his own activities were hindered. Paul's motivation was to reflect and honor Christ, and his purpose for living was the person of Christ. That's why he was able to continue as if nothing at all had changed. Nothing had changed with his imprisonment, because in reality, nothing significant had changed. His purpose was still the same. His methodology simply had to change a little bit. As we look at the last part of our verse here, we see that Paul knew that having Christ as his purpose was not only going to be beneficial in this life, it was going to pay dividends beyond this life. And again, Paul writes, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Paul continues in the verses that follow to describe how the reality of gain after death caused him to desire to depart. He was actually looking forward to what lay beyond this life. And that doesn't indicate that Paul was suicidal. He was merely saying that what was awaiting him was quite attractive to him. It was something that he wanted. Well, the world views death as the end. And in many ways it is. After all, if you're living for the temporal things of this world, then death means the end of all that you've lived for. That's why I said none of those other things are permanent things. When you die, they go away. There's nothing else that you can plug into the formula for me to live as Christ and to die as gain than Christ. If for me to live as possessions, to die is to leave them all behind to someone else. If for me to live as power, there's nothing more powerless than a dead body. If for me to live as popularity, I hate to tell you folks, but to die is to be forgotten. It'll be a miracle if most of us are remembered 2 generations beyond us. The only thing that you get more of when you die is Christ. Only thing. But that's only true if you're living Christ now. Before anyone can live Christ, they have to first be in Christ. They have to be living in union with Christ. Every person who's living in complete trust and dependence on Christ alone is a part of his body. He's united with Christ. And Paul makes that point in Ephesians 5:30, and he spends a good bit of time explaining how that all works in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. But simply put, every believer, and only believers, are in union with Christ, so only believers can honestly say, for me to live is Christ. To live Christ, you have to have given your life to Christ. And the word gain here that Paul uses is a financial term. It indicates interest or dividends paid on an investment. And Paul shows us the reality that death for the believer is to collect both the principal and the interest and to have more of Christ in death than they have in life. But you need to know that Paul wasn't saying that gaining was only reserved for death. He was enjoying Christ during his life as he lived Christ in front of everyone, and he would gain even more of that with his death. People often remark how Philippians is a letter overflowing with joy. It's known as the book of joy. How amazing it is that Paul could write such a letter considering the circumstances he found himself in. But Paul's secret was his motivation and his purpose and his reward were Christ. That was Paul's secret. Paul's circumstances couldn't diminish his quality of life. And he knew that things were only going to get better when he died, because he would then be in the presence of Christ and experience him fully for the first time ever. In the course of my studies this week, I came across a little account that I'd like to share with you. I can't vouch for the authenticity of it or the truth of it, but the story went like this. It says a young man came to W.E. Gladstone when he was Prime Minister of England and said, "Mr. Gladstone, I would appreciate your giving me a few minutes in which I might lay before you my plans for the future. I would like to study law." "Yes," said the great statement, "and what then?" "Then, sir, I'd like to gain entrance to the Bar of England." "Yes, young man, and what then?" "Then, sir, I hope to have a place in Parliament, in the House of Lords." "Yes, young man, and what then?" pressed Gladstone. "Then I hope to do great things for Britain." "Yes, young man, and what then?" "Then, sir, I hope to retire and take life easy." "Yes, young man, and what then?" "Well, then, Mr. Gladstone, I suppose I will die." "Yes, young man, and what then?" Young man hesitated and said, "I never thought any further than that, sir." Looking at the young man sternly and steadily, Gladstone said, "Young man, you are a fool. Go home and think life through." I don't know about you, but Philippians 1:21 is convicting to me. I was convicted this week as I studied and prepared this sermon. I hate to admit how often I allow my own druthers and desires to determine what I do and what I don't do. I can relate to the hymnist who wrote, "Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it." I dare say each of us struggles with self-interest. If we don't do it frequently, then I would suspect we all do it at least occasionally. Because living for self is a hard temptation to overcome. Maybe that's because we can live for self really pretty easily. We can do a whole lot and live for ourselves, or we can do absolutely nothing and live for ourselves. Striving to have others notice us and give us accolades is a way of living for self, as it is conserving our strength and coasting. And even when we try to live for Christ, believers are prone to wander and are always in danger of moving away from Christ toward Christianity, from relationship to religion. It's easy to do. We can be tempted to add to our formula, to say, "For me to live is Christ plus fill in the blank," thinking that we're helping our cause, that surely to add something to Christ would be to help things along. But Christ alone is supposed to be our motivation. Christ alone is to be our purpose, and he's alone to be our reward. So let's go back and consider Alice's inquiry from our earlier illustration and ask, where do you want to get to in 2023? Author Stephen Covey, in his best-selling book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, said that habit number 2 was begin with the end in mind. What he meant by that was pretty much the same thing that the Cheshire Cat was driving at with Alice. You need to know where you want to wind up in order to travel there effectively. Because without a clear destination, you will wind up somewhere, but probably not where you wanted to be. So do you want satisfaction, enjoying this life? Do you want that for this next year? Do you want a rewarding existence now that promises even more in the life to come? Do you want peace in spite of circumstances, in spite of whatever's going on in your life? Do you want peace? Do you want to be able to face death, not with fear and dread, but with eager anticipation? Then mind how you complete the phrase, for me to live is. Because only Christ will cause you to fully enjoy the journey when you get to where you want to be. Let's pray. Father, we confess we are prone to live for ourselves. We're prone to take into consideration our own wants and needs and things that we think we should do, and we ask that you would help us to put your interests first. Father, might we make our purpose the person of your Son and follow his example in this life, so that we might enjoy the peace and satisfaction here and more of the same when we pass on from this life into the next. We ask that people might see Jesus when they look at us. They might be drawn to it. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.